So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking some time this afternoon to join us. There is just a couple of things we want to go over before we get started. All attendee videos are off and mics are muted. And if you have any questions, we have opened the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and the questions will be monitored throughout the session. We'll also monitor the chat as well as we go through this. And right at the end, we'll save some time to go over the questions that you might have. So today's presentation will be recorded, as you might have heard at the beginning, and it will be available afterwards. We do usually upload our presentations to our member portal as well, so you can just reach out by request. So introducing our guest speaker today, we have Jamie Smith. Jamie is with the Real Estate and Development team with the Corey Craig Group, and he is also the Vice President here at Bowman, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. So Jamie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Heather. It's my pleasure today to introduce our two presenters, Bob Bask and Tim Bell. Bob is a founding partner of Fort Bosk here in Moncton, and Bob's a graduate of UDM here in Moncton as well as UNB. Bob is a preferred areas of practice are administrative law, employment law, urban planning issues, civil litigation, and corporate governance. Bob is the past chair of the Law Society of New Brunswick. He's a Greater Moncton Chamber of Commerce member, as well as Rotarian here in Moncton. He's presently the chair of the Law Society of New Brunswick Disciplinary Committee. Tim Bell. Tim Bell's a bilingual litigator focused in areas of labor, employment and law, and administrative law, and again is a partner with Bob. His practices include acting as counsel for members, discipline panels, and prosecutions of regulatory possessions, providing representation throughout New Brunswick in civil suits and professional discipline matters. He has appeared in all levels of courts in New Brunswick, as well as being administrative tribunals. He's a current member of the Law Society for the Complaints Committee. So Bob and Tim, I'll turn it over to you.
Jamie.
Thank you, Jamie, and good afternoon, everybody. I can't see anybody, but I'm told that you're all out there in hyperspace. So this is a presentation that started because Tim and I were getting so many calls about this COVID-19 and all of the issues that it brought to mainly employers in terms of the confusion and the rules that don't seem to change, are changing basically every day. And so we started off with a presentation that's aimed fundamentally at employers and employees. Jamie, I think, attended one of my presentations of this. I've done it a dozen times for one of the organizations in Moncton, and asked if I would do it for your organization. And when I went on your website, I saw that you're not only affiliated with your issue is not only the matter of employer-employee, but also as landlords and property managers. So we've added that element into it, and we've also taken note that some of you operate in Prince Edward Island. So we'll be talking a little bit about the PEI aspect, although Tim and I are mostly New Brunswick lawyers. We've been over to PEI to do a few cases, but our expertise really is in New Brunswick. So we've been predicting for some time, no jab, no job, no jab, no enter was coming down the line. The slide is something we created in one of our very first presentations. And effectively, that's what you're seeing right now is you can't enter into many premises, never mind the restaurants and the bars the government has imposed it on, but other establishments are saying the same thing. You can't come in if you don't wear a mask, and we want to see proof of vaccination, and we're not going to hire you. So that's created a bunch of questions in a whole bunch of sectors. And it seems to me, or seems to most people, that it changes daily. This week, today in particular, it's all about air travel. If you're following the news and what's happening with the airports in Toronto and people who are stuck in South Africa and what's going on in airports. And so the governments are constantly intervening, and there's a whole issue of the vaccine mandates is constantly in the news versus having a mask, taking tests. People are talking about their human rights, the charter rights, occupational health and safety, privacy issues. All of that is coming into play. And there's a lot to consider. Tim, right?
Yeah, so just one of the things that has been sort of thrown around as a term I heard last week on a webinar is pandemic law and vaccination law. And this was on a webinar with some lawyers from an Atlantic Canadian firm. But the idea being that we have now shifted our practice to deal with initially the pandemic in the early parts of 2020, and now, moving out of 2021 and into 22, it's really become vaccination law. And all these different pieces of legislation up on the screen, there's 10 pieces of legislation or more there, along with the orders that come under some of them and regulations that come under the rest, have created this vaccination law that's a very dynamic area of the law, and we're trying to answer questions and give counsel to our clients in a very fast moving environment. So what we're trying to distill to you today, we'll flip to the next one, flip to the next slide, is that we're giving you our best advice and best understanding of the law as it exists today, with the recognition that this is constantly in evolution. And we're giving you general information here today, but every one of you on this call will have particular circumstances with respect to these items that are up on your screen now. So you may or may not have vulnerable clientele. You may have certain expectations with respect to your clients. We'll talk a little bit today about constructive dismissal and how the pandemic and the vaccine may or may not present issues of constructive dismissal. Employee attitudes, and Bob mentioned earlier, employees on the front line versus employees in the back line, that may affect some of the advice that we give and counsel we give. You're also challenged as employers with an inadequate supply of workers. And so, you come up against this push and pull between vaccination mandates and excluding possibility of bringing people into your workforce. And we'll talk a bit about unionized environments, adding that to the puzzle, and then statutes, and all that coupled with everybody's fatigue and mental health issues and anxiety and exhaustion that come with dealing with 2 years of pandemic now. So Bob will set the table for us.
So what we're going to look at basically, and not in order, but basically as a mixture of things, but this is what the underlying issues are. Firstly, what are the obligations and the rights of an employer? And obviously from an owner's point of view as well. Human rights, that term is, discrimination, it's against my rights. That's been thrown around quite a bit. Privacy concepts, this is personal information. What you can't ask that of me. Those are all things that that will underlie what we're going to talk about. And we're also going to look at other considerations that business owners should have. So the first thing is look at employer obligations. And the first one, obviously, is occupational health and safety. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Your second obligation is to not discriminate. You can't, there's certain things that are forbidden from discrimination on, and we'll get to that. We're going to talk about privacy, as I said. And of course, you've got some common law duties that apply to you as either an employer or a landlord or both. And then you've got obligations to your customers or patrons or tenants. Some of you have more, as Tim said, more vulnerable clientele than others, and depending on who you're dealing with. So let's start with occupational health and safety, Tim.
Right. So OH&S, the fundamental premise behind or underlying occupational health and safety, and this is across the board, not just in New Brunswick or Prince Edward Island, but all occupational health and safety, dictates that safety is everybody's business, and safety is sort of primary or trumps, and we'll get into that later. Now, the New Brunswick Occupational Health and Safety Act, in comparison to the Prince Edward Island Act, are ostensibly the same, or at least very similar. There are a couple of nuances, but I think at the end of the day, the obligations are essentially the same. So place of employment in New Brunswick is defined very broadly. So that would include your typical traditional workplace, like the office in which I'm in at the moment. But we've seen all kinds of workers working from home. working remotely, and that would be captured as a place of employment as well. So who needs to be protected under the Occupational Health and Safety Act? Well, every employer has a duty to protect its employees. And then further to that, all employees, as you see there on the bottom green rectangle, all employees have the health and safety of all people around them as their obligation to ensure that all people are safe, or all persons are safe around them. If we flip to the PEI Act, workplace, again, is very broad. It includes fishing vessel, where in New Brunswick it does not, interestingly. And then here, the employer's duty is limited, or is expanded, if you will, to include all people, not just employees. And then the workers as well have to ensure the health and safety of all people that attend at that workplace. So I think ultimately, whether you're looking at the Occupational Health and Safety Act in New Brunswick or Prince Edward Island, the fundamental takeaway is that employers have an obligation to the patrons, and employees as well as employers have obligations to anybody that attends at that workplace.
When it comes to landlords, it's not quite as well defined in legislation. But if you look at, number one, the common law, at common law, all of you who are owners or managers would know that the premises have to be safe. You've got to clear snow, you've got to get rid of the ice, you've got to fix steps, you can't let carpets have tears in them. All of those things, if you don't do them at common law, will bring on an owner liability. Obviously, you have to respect leases and with the legislation that applies, and you have to have quiet enjoyment. The thing about the COVID-19 is that it's acknowledged to be a deadly disease. And so how does that fit in, if you like, not only with employers who have occupational health and safety obligations, but landlords who have to make the property safe? So in New Brunswick, we've got the Residential Tenancies Act that says that a landlord has to comply with health, safety, etc., and then also imposes obligations on tenants to make sure that they conduct themselves in a manner that will not cause a disturbance or a nuisance. And arguably, that could be seen as a disturbance or a nuisance. New Brunswick has a Standard Form of Conveyancing Act, which again, if you put that clause 17 in your lease, what it really means, you're going to follow the rules, you're going to follow the orders, you're going to follow the laws, you're going to do everything that you need to do to make sure the property is safe. PEI's legislation, and again, we're not PEI lawyers, but based on what we can see, it's not quite as clear. There is a Residential Property Act regulation that has statutory conditions for leases. And again, lessor, the landlord, has to keep the property in a good state of repair, fit for habitation, has to comply with standards of health, safety, or housing. And then you've got the Public Health Act rental accommodation regulation, which talks about responsibilities of an owner to make sure that it is kept clean and satisfactory at all times. And then a tenant has to advise employers about any communicable disease that's in the dwelling, etc. So, and those of you who are trying to write all this down, you don't need to. I'll make these slides. We'll make these slides available to BOMA if anybody wants to have them. So that's the occupational health, landlord liability end of it. And it basically comes down to you, if you own a premise, or if you, an employer, may have to make sure that the place is safe. Let's talk about human rights now.
All right. So, with that sort of background in mind, where we're thinking about vaccines, vaccination mandates, a deadly disease, and then sort of occupational health and safety obligations, landlord tenant obligations to keep those areas safe. And then we've also got this piece of legislation in all jurisdictions in Canada called the Human Rights Act, or the Human Rights Code. And it is a code. It sets out exactly the circumstances where discrimination occurs and doesn't, and what's required to constitute discrimination. So the Human Rights Act applies in certain situations and only certain situations. If it's not within one of these circumstances, then it's not discrimination. So these are what's up on the screen today: employment, housing, accommodation, advertising, notices and signs, and professional businesses, trade associations, and so on. So if it doesn't fall under one of those categories, in other words, if it's in a private residence between family members, well, then the Human Rights Act probably wouldn't apply. The areas to which it applies are similar, whether we're looking at PEI or New Brunswick. Now, in terms of
another example where it doesn't apply, and I had that recently, was volunteers. Volunteers aren't listed there, so it doesn't show up. Sorry, no.
No, thanks. And so, in terms of the other aspect that the code captures is the grounds of discrimination. So in New Brunswick, we have 16 grounds plus sexual harassment. They're up there on the screen, but they include race, color, ancestry, place of origin, creed or religion, and so on. And PEI has similar grounds. They're essentially the same, except for the last one on the PEI screen, which is source of income. In New Brunswick, we have social condition. So arguably the same ground, just described differently. But the important takeaway from both of these screens is that if the discrimination is not something that's a protected ground under the Act, then it's not a violation of a person's human rights. And for example, in New Brunswick, we're an officially bilingual province. We have legislation that protects both official languages, but language is not a protected ground under the Human Rights Act. So if a job required, for instance, the ability to speak Mi'kmaq, and a person applied and was unable to speak that language, that would not be a violation of the Human Rights Act. So if it's not in the Act as a protected ground, it does not apply. And this point is important as we get in, and you'll see as we get into this presentation how this sort of plays out with vaccinations.
And the Human Rights Commission has weighed in on this. The commissions have. Here's what New Brunswick says on this issue. And they were getting, we're told, 300 calls a day from people saying this violates my rights. And so they put it on their website. It's a great website if you want to go and read the FAQs there. And we want to give you a couple of examples in this presentation. But they say, no, it's not discrimination, because again, that list that Tim just went through, discrimination for your personal beliefs is not a protected ground under the Human Rights Act. Nova Scotia's is even better, and those of you who are Prince Edward Island is even better, and those of you who are working over there, if you want to look at their website, and even those from New Brunswick, is great. This is the front page, and you click on that COVID-19 icon, and it takes you to a drop-down menu, and they're pretty blunt, aren't they, Tim? They lay it right out.
So they don't mince any words here. They're the question under one of the frequently asked questions. And it's, the questions that are in the FAQ for the Human Rights Commission are essentially the same questions we were getting on a daily basis with our phone calls. And often we would direct these people that want to engage with us and have these arguments with us over the phone. We would refer them to the Human Rights Commission webpage. One of the questions there is there protection under the Human Rights Act for people who choose not to wear a mask or get the vaccine as a matter of personal preference? No, there is no protection. The Act does not provide protection to individuals who choose not to wear a mask to be vaccinated as a matter of personal preference, because, as we indicated earlier, personal preference is not a ground protected under either the PEI Human Rights Act or the New Brunswick Human Rights Act, or any Human Rights Act for that matter.
So then you go to issue of privacy. And what's important to understand about privacy is that it's about collection, use, disclosure, and destruction of information. So if you don't collect the information, then it really doesn't apply, as long as you're not collecting any information. The other thing you should understand about privacy is that most of the legislation that exists right now doesn't apply to most New Brunswick and or PEI employers. PIPEDA is federal legislation which purports to apply to employers, but constitutionally, if you're transmitting information across provincial borders, yes, it applies. But in terms of managing your daily workforce or managing your apartment building, PIPEDA would not apply. New Brunswick and Nova and PEI. I keep wanting to say Nova Scotia. New Brunswick and PEI don't have equivalent PIPEDA legislation. New Brunswick has FIPA, which is personal health information, and PEI has the Health Information Act. New Brunswick has the right to information, and PEI has freedom of information. Those acts apply to basically public bodies, hospitals, municipalities, universities, where there's health information that is stored, doctors' offices, that kind of thing. You would not have that, pharmacies. You would not have that in most businesses where you're holding private information about people or health information. Having said that, most of us now expect a certain respect for our privacy, and it's just good for business to respect people's privacy. Never mind confidentiality as a lawyer has to do, but as you know, in terms of privacy, people's personal information, we are now in our society, we have that expectation. And there's also a new tort in common law that's being developed. It's called intrusion upon seclusion, is evolving and is going to have an impact. All right, so that sets the table: occupational health and safety, landlord obligations to make a safe environment, human rights, and privacy. So let's look at some of the questions that are most frequently asked of us. So the first one is, can an employer ask an employee for medical information? Normally, I can't ask my employee, listen, have you had cancer? Have you had nervous breakdown? Like, what about vaccines, Tim?
Right. So, with that backdrop in place, remembering that an employer's obligation is to keep the workplace safe and the safety of employees and patrons, and the existence of a deadly disease, an employer can ask if an employee is double vaccinated. And that's not necessarily collecting medical information. It's getting a confirmation that that employee is safe to work in that workplace and is able to work in that workplace. Next question on there is, can an employer refuse to hire? And the answer is yes. If a candidate indicates that they are unvaccinated, an employer could refuse to hire that candidate on the basis that a person is unvaccinated. And that wouldn't be a violation of the Human Rights Act, as you've heard today. So moving on to a landlord, the answers to these questions may be a little nuanced. I think you can, as a landlord, if you're looking at or screening potential tenants, are you vaccinated? That's a legitimate question. I think you're on side there. Is your staff vaccinated? I think if you turn that around, you may be getting into personal health information. If you're saying, is your staff vaccinated? Turning that around to sort of ask the question, or make it a condition of your staff entry by saying, we're only hiring staff, or we're only allowing your staff to work in our premises if your staff is vaccinated. So you're not seeking out who's vaccinated and who's not from someone else's staff, but you're imposing a condition to say any staff that comes onto our premises to work must be vaccinated. The landlord could also ask, what is your COVID-19 policy? So what are you doing for testing? What are you doing for masks? What are you doing for social distancing? What are you doing for vaccines? All those sorts of things. And then a landlord can base decisions on the answers to those questions.
Including putting up or saying you can't come in if you're not vaccinated. That's very legitimate. Again, is it discrimination? Yes. It's not, but is it discrimination that's prohibited by the Human Rights Act? Absolutely not. Imposing the wearing of masks, same thing. Terminating a lease, depends on what the lease says, what the terms of the lease are. Or again, you've got to respect the terms of the lease, and landlord legislation, but certainly refusing to renew a lease if someone is not complying with certain policies, and there are some staunch anti-vaxxers out there. Yeah, the landlord could say, we're not going to renew your lease at the end of your term. And again, next one is on the issue of signs, which is another area that could impact on BOMA members.
Right. So you recall signs being one of the areas that are protected signs, notices, advertising under human rights legislation. So the question being, if you've got a building that you own or manage, can you put up a sign that would say no vaccine, no entry, no mask, no entry, or only vaccinated persons need apply? Those sorts of things are legitimate. They're acceptable, and they're not a violation of the Human Rights Act.
Same thing goes for landlords. That, you know, you could have signs that say, we will not rent to you if you're not vaccinated. You can't enter visitors included if you're not vaccinated. Delivery persons, we're starting to see some landlords that are saying everybody who's a delivery person, anyone who's going to come and clean the building must be vaccinated, or else they can't enter. So they're telling their third-party suppliers, everybody who comes in here has to be vaccinated. Interestingly, there's starting to be some reported cases.
So these cases are making their way through the courts and through tribunals. This is a relatively recent decision, or a couple of decisions under the Human Rights Tribunal of Alberta. One was a Costco case where there was a sign on the door indicating that all patrons, all customers had to wear masks, no exceptions, to enter the Costco. And that was taken to the Human Rights Tribunal to be, or alleged to have been in violation of the Human Rights Act, because without exception, meaning that there were no exceptions in the sign saying, you know, if you have a medical exemption, you can come in without a mask, or if you have a religious exemption, you can come in without a mask, or whatever it is. But the tribunal, and in that particular case, Costco had some options for people that couldn't go into the store without a mask, such as curbside pickup and online shopping and so on. So the tribunal upheld that policy and noted the balancing of obligations between, you know, the deadly disease, keeping the patrons safe, and requiring all people to wear masks, regardless of whether there were any human rights exemptions. So we're seeing that even with these potential exemptions for human rights considerations, these policies are still being upheld.
And keep in mind, this is early days, decisions coming up, and we're going to talk about the exemptions for medical and religious reasons in a few minutes. And New Brunswick Human Rights Commission has basically said the same thing, although employers can impose masks, or building owners, anyone can require persons to wear masks. Now they talk about mental or physical disabilities that can create exemptions. For example, someone who's on the autism spectrum or severely paranoid, there may be a mental reason for not imposing that requirement. But generally speaking, unless you fit into an exemption, you can be forced to wear a mask. So the whole issue about human rights is you have to accommodate me. I have a disability, you have to accommodate me. So the question becomes, Tim, if I'm not vaccinated out of personal choice, can I say I need accommodation?
Hopefully at this point in the presentation, people understand or get what the point we're trying to make here is, that personal choice is not a protected ground. If I simply don't believe in the vaccine, or believe that the vaccine is going to cause autism, or have certain views, personal views on the vaccine that make me refuse, well, that's not a protected ground. And as an employer, or as a landlord, business owner, building owner, you don't have to accommodate someone who chooses not to get vaccinated.
Now, let's talk about the religious, medical, religious reasons. And maybe we can start with the religious one. And here's the PEI human rights website. And the second question talks about religious reasons, and that they're saying what our research has basically led us to conclude is that there is no religion that prevents a person from wearing a mask. There are religions that say that you shouldn't get blood transfusion, but even those don't say you should mask. You may have seen the declaration by the Mennonite Church of Canada recently that said, actually, we think that you should wear masks or get vaccinated. It actually is part of is respecting God's 10 commandments to love thy neighbor. So religious reasons, people who have religious certificates, those are very questionable and would not pass muster. In terms of medical reason, well, those are going to be few and far between. Again, the chief medical officers of health right across the country have come up with basically the same kind of position. They say, first, a permanent certificate. If you're a person who can have a severe allergic reaction, there are going to be some of those people. But this is not your GP who gives a note saying, John, you can't take the vaccine. This is going to have to be an allergist who is going to give you a permanent exemption for all four. And I'm told this morning there's a fifth vaccine about to be approved by Health Canada. Excuse me. The other option, the possibility, is for persons who have had a reaction, myocarditis, I think, is to the first dose of mRNA. Those people might be able to get a temporary one and go to a different vaccine. And also there will be people who, because of a health issue, have immunity issues with their system and can't take the vaccine. But again, the medical officers of health right across the country are saying those are going to be very, very rare situations. Of course, the other thing that people raise is this is against my charter rights. So Tim, maybe you want to tackle this one.
Yeah, this is something that it seems like the people that were calling us, and I haven't gotten many calls recently, but they're all reading from the same prayer sheet or the same sort of song sheet where they call and they've got the same arguments and the same points that they raise. And the charter one is typically raised. Our response to that is that nobody is forced to get a vaccine. When you go to get your vaccine, as you know, you walk into whatever the place is and you sign off on a consent form after reading it. And then you're consenting to getting the vaccination in your arm. So no one's getting a needle stuck in their arm without their consent. Secondly, the charter, and I think this is important too, what people don't recognize when they call us, is that the charter only applies to government action and government workers, government employees. So if an employer is requiring everybody to be vaccinated, unless that's the federal government or the provincial government, then the charter doesn't apply. If similarly, if a landlord or a building owner is requiring all people who enter to be vaccinated, again, that's not government action and doesn't apply. Other arguments that have been raised and are, I think, slowly working their way through the courts are the Section 7 argument, the right to life, liberty, and security of the people or person. In that case, it doesn't, you can't say, well, I lost my job because I didn't get vaccinated, and that's a charter violation. Now, you may have a better chance of advancing that argument if you're a government employee, but if you're not, it really doesn't apply. And there's also sections 15 and 2A arguments, but as we've sort of discussed earlier, vaccination or opposition to vaccination and personal choice or freedom of conscience, those don't really trigger either human rights or potential charter arguments. So at this point, we don't see charter arguments being successful to oppose the vaccination. And that's kind of where that stands.
So one of the big issues that, not big issues, but one of the big objections that was thrown out when proof of vaccination was required is this violates my privacy rights. So this question is, does asking for proof of vaccination violate your privacy rights? We say, Tim, no.
No. So the list here of can you ask for proof from an employee, from a potential new hire, from a client, patient, patron, tenants, potential and existing, the answer is yes. You can ask for proof of vaccination. And I mean, for a couple of reasons. One, you're not collecting personal information or personal health information. You're verifying it. You're checking a phone that has an app on it and a little green check mark, or a page that has a check mark, and you're verifying identification to confirm that the person holding up their proof of vaccination is the person that they purport to be with their driver's license. And that's not any different from going to a liquor store and providing your identification, or going to a bar or a restaurant, or staying overnight in a hotel room and providing your identification to show that you are who you purport to be. So the answer to all these is yes, and you're not gathering or taking personal health information in this case. You're just confirming identity and confirming vaccination.
So if an employee is not vaccinated, the next question, of course, and perhaps the answer is obvious, that can you say, I want you to tell me when you're vaccinated? And absolutely, an employer or a building owner could require a report of their tenants to say, okay, we want a report to say everybody when that happens. Not who and not names, and you can't take any notes down, but you can certainly say, yes, everybody's vaccinated. And some of the people don't understand that even the federal, provincial, and territorial privacy commissioners have came out in May of 21 that said actually vaccine passports might enhance our personal liberties, because they allow us to go to social gatherings, they allow us to go to restaurants and bars, they allow us to gather collectively. So it's not necessarily all a negative thing that you have vaccine passports. So against all of that, let's talk about the rights of employers, because we were seeing things like, pay without leave, go home unless you're vaccinated. So the questions that we're getting is, well, is that constructive dismissal? Because generally speaking, an employer doesn't have the right to say an employee, go home and I'll pay you when I call you back in. Is it the construction? Is it grounds for dismissal if the employee is working in an environment where you've got vulnerable clients? Those are issues that we're grappling with, and it's a case-by-case analysis, because an employee who's working obviously with vulnerable people in a healthcare environment is not the same thing as the employee who is in the warehouse picking orders, or is doing data input from home. What we're also seeing is a lot of employers that are saying, well, I, for example, supply truck drivers to a large company, or I supply cleaning services, and my clients, the third parties, are saying, well, no, all of your drivers you send me and all of the people that you send to clean my office after hours, I insist they be vaccinated. So what we're seeing is we're getting employers that are saying to employees, I don't have any work for you. That triggers the concept of the frustration of contract. And the contract is said to be frustrated if both parties of the contract want to execute it. Employer, I want to send you. Employee, I want to go. But because of a third party intervention, you can't respect the contract, not because of your will, but because of a third party factors. So all of those situations are giving rise to all kinds of circumstances that have to be taken on a case by case. The other, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on unions, and the other, it's going to depend on to how your unions react if you have a union. And the unions have taken two different stances. The RCMP union is defending Mounties, while Unifor, which is arguably one of the biggest operations in Canada, our unions in Canada, has said, no, we think it's a bona fide requirement. Our Air Canada Pilots Union has said the same thing, and we're not going to represent our members. We're not going to defend them if they decide that they don't want to get vaccinated out of personal preference. So there are cases that are developing in this area. There have been there are two decisions in Ontario last month. One went for the union, one went for the employer. Where it's all going to land, it depends on a whole number of factors. So we're pretty much running on time. Just want to talk about other things you should be considering as employers. One of them is that we talked about occupational health and safety, but some people don't realize that it is a criminal code offense if you're directing a workforce and you fail to take reasonable steps to ensure the safety of workers and the public. It's the Westray Amendment, they call it, to the criminal code after the disaster in Westray, Nova Scotia. And so it can be a criminal offense. And arguably, I would say that COVID-19 certainly falls into that area of danger in the workforce. What we're seeing in most of the cases that have come up is that safety seems to be trumping all. There are ways to do it. There are how you implement policies, how you apply things. You have to be careful. But the bottom line is that safety appears to be the overriding factor. We talked about the common law tort of intrusion upon seclusion evolving, and yeah. Tim, a couple of other factors or facts.
Right. So employers and owners, managers are encouraged to have policies in place that are carefully crafted and deal with, eventualities, and particularly trying to deal with employees that don't get vaccinated or patrons that don't get vaccinated, and what your options are at that point. We've been assisting a lot of clients with developing these policies. Bob mentioned sort of the cleaning examples. Another example that we're seeing in terms of how this is affecting workplaces is in the construction industry, where construction managers or contractors are requiring in their RFPs that everybody on site is required to be vaccinated. So that, there's a trickle-down effect there when at the top, there's a requirement for vaccinations across the board. When it comes to subcontractors and so on, they have to make determinations on how they deal with their subs that are or are not vaccinated. And then mental health considerations are making their way into these questions. So here we are 2 years into the pandemic now, and everybody's exhausted by this and done with this, but the pandemic is not done with us. So we need to, I think, be sensitive that everybody is dealing with these questions, these issues, the anxiety, and all manner of mental health issues that may be associated with dealing with vaccine hesitancy or whatever. And as a building owner, manager, employer, being sensitive that these could be considerations underlying what's going on as well, and addressing those appropriately.
All right, so we've left some time for some questions. I don't know if there's anything in the chat. I'll stop sharing here.
Yes, there is, Bob. So, Bob, thank you to you and Tim for your presentation today. Very informative. There was a lot of great questions and answers that I've been looking for through your presentation. And we do see one question, and it says, what constitutes a deadly disease in legal terms? A lot of other conditions, ailments have been contagious and deadly, like the flu, but asking status of blood level of protections is unprecedented.
Yeah, that's true, but there haven't been pandemics. There hasn't been a pandemic in 100 years. And yeah, the flu can be deadly in some circumstances, but not to this level. According to the medical information as we understand it. I mean, it's a global pandemic, and as the variants evolve, it's not getting better. As Tim says, it's not done with us yet.
Okay, we see there, Jocelyn has asked a question there. Can a tenant require that the landlord ask for proof of vaccination for general public entering into the office building?
Can a tenant require that of a
Yeah.
landlord?
Yeah, can the tenant require that the landlord ask for proof of vaccination for general public entering into an office building?
I would say the tenant only has control over their space. You know, you lease a certain amount of space. You don't lease the entire building, but unless it's a condition of the lease, you certainly could put that in a lease. But unless it's in a lease, I don't think a tenant could impose that on the landlord for the entire office building.
Okay. Is there any other questions for Bob and Tim today?
Everybody's hungry.
Everybody's hungry. Any final comments from Bob and Tim, or we're good?
No, I think the more of this kind of information is getting out there, the easier as Tim said, we're seeing a decrease, if you like, in what people are asking these questions about you know, your rights, and we're telling people, well, you know, it's fine about insist on your rights. There is no absolute right. The Charter of Rights even says that they're limited by what's reasonable in a just society. And the other part of that, of course, is obligations. We all have obligations, and even the religious orders that don't necessarily encourage it are saying, well, it may be part of your Christian obligation or your moral obligation to be vaccinated. So my last comment would be, get vaccinated if you're not.
Mhm.
Okay. Well, I think there's no other questions I see, or nothing in the chat. So thanks again, Bob and Tim, for doing this for us. Heather?
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. We really appreciate you, both Bob and Tim, taking some time today. There's always these questions around this, so it was a really informative session. Again, if you think of anybody on the session that thinks of any questions afterwards, please reach out. We'll be more than happy to reach out to Bob and Tim to get those questions answered for you. And as I mentioned earlier, that the session was recorded and it will be available to our members. So feel free to reach out, and we'll also have it on our website as well. So thank you, everyone. Thank you.
The other thing too, I don't know if you mentioned that, but there is a paper, Jamie, I think you've gotten
Yes.
that, and
Yes.
you've got it, Heather, in both official languages.
Yes.
That has a lot more information than what we're able to transmit in an hour. And I've shared it with you. I'll be happy to share the PowerPoint presentation if anybody can't sleep or something. You can look at it again.
All right, that'd be great. Yeah, we'll get a few of those items up on our website as well. It'll be awesome.
Okay.
Awesome.
Very good.
Thank you so
Very
much.
good.
Have
Thanks,
a good
everyone.
afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Merry
Bye.
Christmas.
Merry
Happy
Christmas.
holidays.
Merry Christmas.
Bye.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.